Good day, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to another thrilling episode of Fraud O'Clock, a podcast brought to you by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners South Africa. I am your host, Gatle Osekapota, and joining me today is none other than Jeff Wicks. Thank you very much for coming, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate your time. So Jeff is an investigative journalist at News 24 and is a two-time winner of the Taco Caper Award for Investigative Journalism. He covers a wide variety of topics with a broad focus on intelligence as well as law and order. He is the co-author of 8 Days in July, Inside the Zuma Unrest that set South Africa alight, which was published by NBE Publishers in 2021. To dive right into the thick of things, before we get to deeper detail about what you do, I think it would be important to first know, where does your love of journalism stem from?
Yeah, it's a question that strikes to the heart of why I do this. I was a bit undecided when I finished school about what I wanted to do, and a teacher of mine that saw some potential in me suggested that I read a book called The Bang Bang Club, and the book is about South African photojournalists who operated during the height of apartheid. And I read that book and saw all the work that they were doing and dodging bullets, and I thought this looks like an exciting pursuit and something I'd want to follow. And I studied journalism at the Durban University of Technology, and it was very different from what I'd read in the book. Obviously times had changed, but since I began, I'd always had a focus on crime and justice. And I knew that I wanted to do a bit work that was more in-depth and also work that affects change. And I'd always wanted to be an investigative journalist, and it took me 13 years of working in the trenches to get into the post that I currently occupy as a member of News 24's investigations team.
We've also seen that fraud and corruption seem to be a key theme in, most of your articles. So I think the question that we want to ask right now is, in what state would you say South Africa is in right now? And can we expect like a paradigm shift in the aftermath of the elections?
Well, to answer the first aspect of your question, I think South Africa is in a perilous state. And, these are not concerns of my own, but the general consensus in society. I think fraud and corruption have grown to a proportion that's endemic. It's also no surprise. I mean, the reach and extent of state capture was codified by the Chief Justice. We know that a single family managed to loot 50 billion rand from the economy and influence government by holding sway over the president. That's just the macro level corruption. The work that we do every day confronts the scourge, and we see that it has seeped into every facet of the state and the private sector. And it is a very depressing reality to confront, because when you think to yourself, if only every tax rand reached its intended destination, South Africa would be a different place. We are part of a 5-member investigations team at News 24, and I can tell you that corruption takes up all of our time. Obviously, we each have different focus areas, but it's never ending and it's unrelenting. And in terms of the journalistic work that we do, we receive information from whistleblowers and from informants, and we have to now pick and choose what we look at. And the focus area for us is addressing political influence and its associated corruption in bleeding state coffers, because we operate in the public interest, and we have to safeguard that money in some way, shape, or form by telling the truth and exposing what we can. What I will say is that it is completely overwhelming, and it's getting to a point, perhaps not a tipping point, but a point of no return, especially in some aspects of society. As to whether we will see any green shoots after this government of national unity, that remains to be seen. What we do need from this government of national unity is increased accountability and transparency, because we operate in an opaque state, and that is by design.
But just to also address a key point that you mentioned, with all the reports that you've released and the articles that you've written, like you said, on state capture, as well as that particular family that looted from South Africa, I mean, the reports are there, they're in your face. Why has there been such an oblivious, response from society, from South Africa in general. I mean, if you're reporting on such cases and you're exposing them, we should be seeing a more proactive or reactive response from the public, but we haven't seen that. What could be the reason?
I'm not sure that the public's oblivious, but I think they've been worn down over the years. And I think the South African public has taken a complete battering from corruption. I mean, if you think of the word tenderpreneur, that's a South African term. It's been part of our DNA, and it's become part of the fabric of who we are as South Africans. And you kind of get to the point where it's just an everyday occurrence. To be honest, in the journalism that we do, we now have to pick and choose, and it's usually informed by the amount that's been stolen. Whereas in a first world setting, a 1.5 million rand corruption saga would see politicians resigning and law enforcement agencies acting. So I'm not sure the public are oblivious, but I think they have been browbeaten by the fact that there is a level of impunity that should not be allowed. And that impunity comes from the fact that law enforcement agencies, both the NPA and the police, were completely denuded and kneecapped during the state capture period to service political ends, obviously. But the collateral damage in that is that our ability to fight crime, arrest people, and then convict them has been completely hamstrung because of capacity constraints, none of which will surprise any of your viewers. And South Africa needs a change. And it's an accountability thing. But the problem is, in order to address that change, we need to completely reshape our policing strategy. We need to completely recapacitate organs like the NPA. The investigating directorate needs autonomy and a good budget. And people need to start seeing convictions. And, state capture is the period from 2010 onwards. Not one person has been convicted. And I think when people start seeing accountability, I think the paradigm shift will occur.
Fantastic. Thank you for your input on that. So one particular case that stands out for me personally is the case of Babita Deokaran. The ferocity in which you approached that case, one could almost say that it struck a chord within you. So how did you initially come across this case? And would you say that the hands of justice have failed you on this one?
So we were made aware that there'd been an assassination in the south of Joburg in August of 2021. Unfortunately, we live in a violent society where shootings occur daily. So it's not something that really appeared on our radar until we established exactly who the victim was. And it was clear to us from looking at the manner of the shooting that it was intentional. It was an obvious hit. And she was an accountant within the Gauteng Department of Health. And she had obviously been killed for a reason, and collectively, as a team, we decided to try and understand what that was, because, the murder and broad daylight assassinations of public servants does not augur well for society. So we began tracking the investigation, and it became a long-term project for us. And we followed the arrest of 6 men who the police have now successfully convicted as being the triggermen in the matter. But we always knew that there was something more, and we couldn't figure out the why. We really wanted to understand why she was murdered, and to do that, we needed to understand who had motive. And, corruption is so deep-rooted at the Gauteng Department of Health. It's like a needle in a haystack. It could be anything from security tenders to construction tenders, anything. And I was convinced that there would be answers on her cell phone. And over the course of several months, I got very close to her family. And, obviously these are salt-of-the-earth people who don't deserve what happened to them. And they were devastated by the loss, because really she was an uncontroversial figure, just an accountant.
Yes.
And they didn't know why she'd been murdered. And I said to them, well, I will give you an undertaking that until there's no more breath left in my chest, I'll chase this story. And we needed to work together. And several months went by, and we were obviously tracking the progress of the police investigation, and typically it was very slow. But we gave them the benefit of the doubt. But in the back of my mind, I wanted the cell phone and the laptop, which had been seized by the police on the day she was murdered. 7 months had passed, And I figured that the police would have been done with the investigation because imaging those devices doesn't take long. And finding out exactly where that was would also give us an indication of how they were approaching the probe. So I asked the family to request them. And within a day, they'd been handed back to them, and we went and collected them, took them to a forensic company that broke into the cell phone and the laptop. And within a week, we had 16,000 lines of cell phone data tracking her every movement, Google search, email received, message sent, and 60,000 emails from the Department of Health server. And we suspected that her death might have something to do with Tembisa. And we keyed in that first keyword into the search bar, and the first thing that popped up was a report that she filed 3 weeks before she was murdered that had tried to stop 100 million rands worth of payments and flagged 850 million rand more. And 19 days after she sent that to her boss, she was assassinated outside her house. And that is really sort of the lodestar of our investigation. And from there, we published nearly 36 stories, exposés, and a full-length feature documentary. And our work continues. Unfortunately, the network that she found the first shades of is endemic, and it is stretched into many, many avenues within the Gauteng Health Department, implicating top-level officials and politicians, as we've exposed in our series.
Phew. It's very appalling that they've become so relentless as to assassinate someone, a mother, a wife, a human being, and in broad daylight like that. But to some extent, aren't you also putting yourself in danger by approaching such a case? Of course, you've seen what happens to the person who actually blew the whistle. Now you want to blow the lid off the entire thing, which you did. So,
listen, this project has not been without its risks. We operated on the assumption that we would assume the same danger that she did, because after she filed that report, she was killed. Then any will to stop those payments disappeared and the payments were processed. The report was covered up and it was buried. It was only after we got involved that that report even came to light, because it was sent to one person and then it was completely squashed. You should ask yourself why that happened. So we were operating in the environment that we would face the same dangers. So for the first couple of stories, I didn't take a byline. When we felt like we were getting close to danger or flying close to the flame, I had protection, I had bodyguards. But this story, which I've been working on for nearly two years now, has altered every facet of my life. I haven't had a comfortable drive in 2 years. I'm constantly watching who's behind me, who's following me, how many people in the car, are the windows open, have I seen this car before? It's a constant state of alertness and awareness that is exhausting. When we were at the height of what we were publishing, I was shut up in the house because moving anywhere required an armed escort. And then every aspect of your life is planned. My wife and I couldn't travel together. I had to improve security at my home. And it's a cost of investigative journalism that not many people see. People see the headlines and they see the stories, but they don't see the work that goes into it. That said, I'd made a promise to the Deokaran family. And beyond my promise to them, our job is to speak truth to power. Our job is to bring into the light what is done in the dark. And it's an incredible responsibility that I take seriously. And we operate in the public interest. So not only do we advocate for the Deokaran family who deserved answers, but we advocate for every patient who goes to a public hospital and doesn't get the care that they deserve. And that's been one of the driving forces for me. And there have been times where I've had crises of conscience. You know, is it worth it? Is the story worth my life? And the answer that I've come out with is yes, because it's not only about stealing billions of rands worth of public funds, but it's about the damage done to whistleblowing and the importance of whistleblower protection in the South African setting. Because I should imagine that any prospective whistleblower would see what happened to Babita Deokaran and be like, it's much easier to keep quiet. Exactly. At least then I'm alive.
Mm. And thank you for touching on that point, actually, which was what I was going to address. So what's been happening to whistleblowers lately? Don't you think that's sort of like a tact to demoralize anyone that wants to speak up against corruption?
No, absolutely. This, not only her murder, but I mean the general treatment of whistleblowers
Yes.
must have a devastating, chilling effect on the anti-corruption fight. And, you know, it's something that's so difficult to measure, because how do you gauge how many people didn't come forward? Who would have? And, you know, that's why it's so important that we advocate for legislative change in South Africa. Whistleblowers are not protected. You know, all they've got to protect them is the Protected Disclosures Act, which is really a labor law, and it's outdated and archaic. The Justice Department under Minister Lomola was working on new legislation to beef up whistleblower protection. But again, it's a legislative process and the wheels turn slowly. And now we have a new minister, so now we must understand whether or not this will be delayed further. Every day we don't have comprehensive whistleblower protection is a day that corruption thrives in South Africa. There has to be a mechanism that these people are adequately protected. You know, you can consider something like the Magnitsky Act in America, where whistleblowers receive a portion of the recovered funds. That's certainly a possibility, but we need to be looking at international benchmarks and seeing what works elsewhere. Also, we need to try and force some sort of societal change, that whistleblowers should not be seen as pariahs, but rather hailed as heroes. You know, and going back to the Deokaran case, you know, this was a quiet woman. She was an accountant. She was a family person who loved to cook and loved to spend time with her daughter. I don't think she went out to be a whistleblower. I think she went out to be a dedicated public servant, yes. And by virtue of that, she was murdered. In as much as we need to protect whistleblowers, we also need to professionalize the public service.
True.
It becomes a moral issue at its base. And corruption cannot be so endemic without there being a moral underlying problem, in my view.
I have to agree with you on that one. I mean, corruption needs to be dismantled at a very fundamental level. So here at the ACFE, we believe that, you know, we need to first instill it from the ground roots, which is from high school. Because, you know, if we can still that energy or you know, that belief of patriotism, you know, people need to be patriots. They need to love their country. And it's very damaging what they've done to, like I said, they glamorize tenderpreneurship. You know, some kids even think that's a legitimate career. You know, if you ask them what they want to do, I want to go into tenders, because we see a lot of people in the tabloids, in articles, they've looted so much money, but nothing has been happening to them. So I think there really needs to be a fundamental change in you know, society's mental framework and how they approach corruption. So I also want to know, on the other hand, you're quite exceptional at what you do. You know, there's no doubt about that. So how did you hone your investigative skills? You did mention that you studied journalism at DUT, but how do you continually hone them?
So, I mean, journalism by its very nature is inquisitive, and there's an adage in journalism that all journalism is investigative journalism, because ultimately we try and get as close to the truth as we can.
Yes.
Investigative journalism is obviously sometimes a lonely pursuit, because you have very long lead times, immense amounts of paperwork to go through, and you need to try to piece together stuff which is well hidden. I think a key part of that is being comfortable with what I don't know, and seeking counsel and guidance from experts and our sources and people who can tell us where to look. And, you know, I'm very lucky to be part of a team of very experienced journalists and we operate as a unit. You know, we have collectively nearly 80 to 100 years of journalism experience between us, and I call on them often. And also, because of my background as a crime reporter, I'm familiar with the way the justice system works and the way crimes are investigated. But by and large, it's the application of logic and then looking for patterns. And I mean, what we did with the Tembisa hospital investigation was, I knew little to nothing about public procurement at a hospital level. I had to learn that. And then once you understand the framework, then you can understand where the anomalies are. And that's how we basically tracked down nearly 200 fake companies that existed only on paper. Because we saw patterns. We saw that one individual would have 10 companies all doing trade with the hospital at the same time. Or another person would have 5 companies, but they were all registered on the same day. And then when we started visiting their addresses, we saw their addresses were fake. So then it's about following the breadcrumbs. And each investigation is different. But in terms of a particular honing of skills, many journalists, myself included, do so on the job, and we do so by writing.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I think more than anything, you need to be passionate about it, because it's very hard to actually develop that kind of, drive to actually pull through with it. But moving on to whistleblowers again, and I'm not sure if you've ever read our report to the nations. It's a report compiled by various CFEs, and it mentions that 42% of fraud that is identified was through tip-offs, so whistleblowers. Now, for our members or people out there that want to actually expose malpractices and corruption, how would you as a journalist ensure that their identities remain anonymous?
Well, I mean, there's well-established journalistic praxis around this, and we deal with whistleblowers and informants all the time. We take extensive measures to ensure that their identities are protected. We have mechanisms for people to deliver documents to us anonymously. When we understand who you are and where you fit into a particular organization that you're giving us information on, we have secure communication lines that we foster, and we take every single precaution available to us to protect their identity, because we know what's at stake. We know that people die over this information, and it's incredibly brave of these individuals who cannot stand either inaction by their own institutions on acting on these things, or the fact that they're being persecuted because they tried to act against them, who come to the press, and most often as a last resort. And I can say that in my career, I've never jeopardized a source, and you can lock me up and take me to court. I'll never reveal my sources. I'd rather go to jail. And that's because good journalism is about credibility, and credibility is the only shield that you have in this industry. And it's about public trust, and the public needs to trust that what we say is true, accurate, and we've checked everything and checked it 3 times. So there's well-established safeguards in place that we apply whenever we deal with whistleblowers and informants.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now, in closing, and I know you mentioned that, people haven't been seeing a lot of convictions. Maybe that's what's, defeating the morale of the public. But what do you think law enforcement can do better, or as well as the public, in curbing the scourge of fraud and corruption?
Well, I think from a law enforcement perspective, the new police minister has his work cut out for him. He's inherited an organization that is bloated, under-resourced, and at a point where they're becoming largely ineffectual. Under Bechtele's tenure, the murder rate rose to the highest point in 2 decades. We have a detection rate or a solve rate of murders of 1 in 10. It can never be that South Africans enjoy a safe society with those figures. And those figures are also instructive because it tells us that the policing strategy is not working. The police in particular have become an employment agency. All the public PR you see around it is boots on the ground, boots on the ground. We don't need boots on the ground. We need detectives, and we need well-resourced, well-paid, and well-equipped detectives, because crime is not perpetrated by 63 million South Africans. It's perpetrated by a small group of people who have operated with impunity for years. You take those individuals off the street, prosecute them, put them behind bars, and your crime rate will drop. This is what scholars tell us. It's also no secret. And it's something that's been ignored because there's been no political will to enforce this shift. From the perspective of the MPA, they rely on what the police give them. They come in for a lot of shtick when it comes to the public about no convictions. And they do have a burden to bear in that respect, but they essentially rely on what they're given by the police. And if they're given a bad product, of course they're not going to get a conviction. But again, the NPA is an institution that was riven by state capture. Experienced prosecutors left because they were worked out, because they were too effective at their jobs. And, since Shamila Batoy took the helm, she's been in a rebuilding phase. Also, beset by budget cuts. It's about really overhauling the entire criminal justice system to make it effective and to make it work. Because once you do that, South Africans feel safer, investment increases, we have more jobs. Then it addresses the societal issues of poverty and inequality that drives petty crime. We need to go after the big names and the politically connected names, because it's about accountability. And that will also force a moral shift, because once people see that entrepreneurs are not just flying off to Dubai with their slay queens and spending millions on supercars, but instead they do the corruption, then they become impoverished because the money is seized, and then they go into polls more. That will be an active deterrent against the impunity that we see.
That would be very much an awakening call. But do you ever see that happening?
I'm hopeful. There's some arms of law enforcement that are honestly doing God's work, and I do believe that there are good policemen and good prosecutors who are really up against it in terms of resources and backing. And, on behalf of the public, I'm thankful to them. And I'm thankful for the work that they do, because it's also unsafe. Because as soon as you become a hard worker and go after the people who are dangerous, you make yourself a target. And that's the environment that we need a complete shift in.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I'd also just like to mention that there are people that are actually putting in the work. We do have a lot of people from law enforcement that we are currently training, that they're actively, participating, in all the training events that we have, just so that they can upskill themselves. I know you mentioned that professionalization is also a key thing that they should take note of. So, it's a slow process, but I believe we will get there eventually. So yes, I haven't lost all hopes, and it's also thanks to the work that the likes of you and your team are doing.
Thank you very much.
Right. But having said that, we can call that a wrap, everybody. Thank you very much, Jeff Wicks. Thank you so much for availing yourself. Now, before we officially close, Jeff, do you ever see yourself writing the CFE exam?
I would never rule it out. But
so that's a yes. That's amazing.
But I'm not one for academia, so it would require a lot of study on my part. But perhaps you can find someone to guide me.
Give it a shot. Give it a shot. Thank you very much, Jeff Wicks, everybody. Take note and take care. I hope you all learned a lot. See you guys on the next episode of Fraud O'Clock. Thank you.